the world of music didn't just lose a legend. It lost a lifeline. On July 22, 2025, Ozzy Osbourne, known across generations as the Prince of Darkness, took his final breath after years of punishing health battles, relentless pain, and a fight against Parkinson's that stole more than just his strength. But this wasn't just the end of a career. It was the closing note of a story that began in silence, screamed through suffering, and ended with something most people never expected: peace. From near suicide to superstardom, from stage-diving madness to hospital beds and whispered goodbyes, Ozzy's life was never ordinary. And his final act? It may be the most haunting and heroic chapter of all. Before we dive in, hit like as a simple tribute to a man who gave the world everything he had, and left behind an echo louder than any scream. Long before the world knew him as Ozzy Osbourne, he was just a scared, silent boy in a crumbling home in Aston, Birmingham. Born into poverty in 1948 as John Michael Osbourne, he shared a tiny, freezing house with 6 siblings and 2 exhausted parents who had no time for tenderness. His father came home from the factory with fists instead of hugs. His mother, drained from endless shifts on the assembly line, rarely spoke unless it was to correct. And Ozzy? He wasn't the clever one. He wasn't the favorite. He was the one everyone overlooked. School offered no escape. Dyslexia turned letters into chaos. Teachers dismissed him as stupid. Classmates saw weakness and attacked. The bullying wasn't verbal, it was violent. Blood on his shirt. Bruises he didn't bother to explain. And at home? No sympathy. His father once beat him for coming home in tears. Not because of what happened, but because he cried about it. The silence grew. Not just outside, but inside. He stopped speaking unless necessary. He stopped hoping. And by age 14, that silence nearly swallowed him whole. One cold afternoon, in a small bedroom soaked in hopelessness, he tied a rope using his mother's washing line, stood on a chair, and waited to leave the world quietly. But fate didn't show up with mercy. It showed up with violence. His father burst in, pulled him down and beat him again. That moment didn't save him. It scarred him, and yet it changed something. The pain didn't go away, but a layer of him hardened. And from that cracked foundation, something unexplainable began to stir. He wouldn't become a dreamer. He'd become something louder, something terrifying, something unforgettable. By 17, John Michael Osbourne had already been chewed up by the world. He had no education, no skills, and no future. He floated from job to job: slaughterhouse, construction, factory, always getting fired, always forgotten. Hunger gnawed at him, literally. His shoes had holes. His jacket was falling apart. He wasn't chasing dreams. He was just trying not to starve. And then came the breaking point. In 1965, he attempted a petty robbery, just a bit of clothing to survive, but he was caught. Sentenced to 6 weeks in Winston Green prison, he entered not as a criminal, but as a ghost. A boy society had already thrown away. Inside those prison walls, the silence was deafening, the loneliness unbearable. And then it happened. One afternoon, a cheap radio crackled to life, and the Beatles' "She Loves You" burst through the static. It wasn't just a song, it was a lifeline. In that moment, something split wide open inside him. He didn't know how to sing. He didn't know how to play. But he knew this. He had to make music. Not to be famous, but to survive. "I didn't want to disappear," he later said. "I wanted to be heard. I wanted to be loud." That prison radio didn't give him talent. It gave him a reason. A reason not to hang from that rope again. A reason to keep breathing. From that moment forward, his mission became crystal clear. Scream louder than the pain. be so loud that the world couldn't ignore him again. And that scream would one day shake the foundations of rock itself. But his first attempt at music? That wasn't magic. That was chaos. And what happened next would change the sound of music forever. The first time he walked into that run-down rehearsal room in Birmingham, he wasn't thinking about changing music. He just needed a way out. A newspaper ad looking for a vocalist led him to 3 other misfits men who, like him, carried their own shadows. There was Tony Iommi, the guitarist who'd lost the tips of his fingers in a factory accident and built homemade prosthetics to keep playing. Geezer Butler, the bassist who was fascinated by the occult and wrote lyrics soaked in doom. And Bill Ward, a drummer whose playing felt like controlled chaos. Together, they called themselves Earth, but it didn't stick. Then one day, they saw people lining up outside a movie theater for a horror film called Black Sabbath. If people paid to be scared, Ozzy said, why not scare them with music? And just like that, the sound of heavy metal was born. This wasn't polished rock and roll. This was dread. This was fury. This was pain carved into riffs and spat into microphones. Their debut album, Black Sabbath, released on Friday the 13th of February, 1970, felt cursed from the start. Critics hated it. One reviewer called it satanic filth. But the kids? They felt it in their bones. To the outcasts, the broken, the misfits, Ozzy's scream wasn't noise. It was validation. The world didn't ask them how they were doing, but he screamed it for them. That same year, they dropped Paranoid. Songs like War Pigs, Iron Man, and Paranoid weren't just hits, they were lifelines. Ozzy's voice was jagged, imperfect, and completely real. He wasn't trained. He didn't read music. But he didn't have to. His trauma did the singing for him. He wasn't acting. He was exercising something. And as their music began shaking the world, something else began to break underneath. Because even as he gave voice to a generation's pain, Ozzy was being swallowed by his own. What came next wasn't success. It was collapse. By the mid-1970s, Ozzy Osbourne stood on the mountaintop of heavy metal. Black Sabbath wasn't just a band anymore. It was a movement. They had rewritten the rules of rock, given a voice to the voiceless, and crowned Ozzy as the undisputed Prince of Darkness. But behind the stage lights and roaring crowds, his soul was quietly imploding. The demons never left. They just waited. Childhood trauma, endless touring, toxic escape rituals, everything he'd buried began to rise. Missed rehearsals, slurred interviews. The sparkle in his eyes? Gone. And his brothers in music noticed. In 1979, without warning, without a face-to-face conversation, they sent someone else to do it. They fired him. I didn't even get to say goodbye, Ozzy later said. They didn't have the balls to do it themselves. That band was his lifeline, his only sanctuary. And now it was gone. He spiraled. Alone in a Los Angeles hotel room, curtains drawn, soul hollowed out, he disappeared into a haze of drugs and self-destruction. He later admitted, I sat in that room trying to feel nothing, just waiting to disappear. And that should have been the end. But fate brutal and strange had one more twist. Her name was Sharon Osbourne, the daughter of Sabbath's manager. She saw the wreckage, but also the spark buried beneath. She believed he wasn't done. She believed there was magic left, and she fought for it. She dragged him out of the darkness, both emotionally and literally. Hired musicians, booked studio time, forced him back into the world, one broken step at a time. Then came Randy Rhoads, a quiet, disciplined guitar prodigy who played like he was channeling something holy. He didn't just match Ozzy's chaos, he tempered it. Together, they recorded Blizzard of Oz in 1980. It wasn't just an album, it was a resurrection. Tracks like Crazy Train and Mr. Crowley didn't sound like a comeback. They sounded like revenge. "I'm still here," Ozzy roared. "I still matter." But fate wasn't finished punishing him. On March 19, 1982, during a tour stop in Florida, tragedy struck with no warning. Randy, along with makeup artist Rachel Youngblood, climbed into a small private plane for a joyride. It was supposed to be harmless, but on the third pass, the wing clipped the tour bus. The plane spun, exploded. Everyone on board died instantly. Ozzy saw it happen. He ran screaming toward the fireball, calling Randy's name until his voice cracked and failed. And when he collapsed near the wreckage, sobbing and shaking, something inside him shattered for good. "I lost my brother," he said later. "I lost my reason." For days he couldn't speak. For weeks he barely moved. For months he existed in a fog of alcohol, painkillers, and unbearable grief. The man who had risen from nothing, who had survived abandonment, humiliation, addiction, had to bury the one person who helped him believe again. And after that, even music couldn't save him. But somehow he kept going, because buried deep beneath the wreckage was still a heartbeat. You'd think losing Randy Rhoads would be the worst moment of his life. It wasn't, because grief doesn't just haunt, it mutates. And for Ozzy Osbourne, the years after Randy's death were a slow, cruel unraveling of everything he had left. He didn't just lose his spark. He lost his grip on reality. The stage remained. The shows continued. But backstage, he was vanishing. Every bottle became an escape hatch. Every pill, a sedative for the guilt. He barely remembered tours. He forgot conversations. His children saw a father who wasn't there. And Sharon, the woman who had pulled him from the ashes, was now watching him slide right back into them. By 1987, alcohol had devoured him. He was hollow, paranoid, on the edge of something even he couldn't explain. And then came August 1989, a night so dark, so horrifying, that even he would struggle to talk about it years later. In a haze of drugs and delusion, Ozzy did something unforgivable. He attacked Sharon. He later confessed, "It wasn't me. I don't remember it. I was watching it happen like I wasn't even in my own body." The police came. He was arrested. But instead of prison, Sharon, shattered but still determined, had him committed to a psychiatric facility. It wasn't just punishment. It was his last chance. Inside those sterile walls, stripped of the music, the madness, the mask, he sat in silence. For weeks, he barely spoke. Nurses described him as a man whose soul had gone quiet. And then a counselor asked him a simple question: "What do you fear most?" Ozzy's answer came fast: "That she leave. That I pushed her too far." But she didn single quotes T. Sharon returned not with softness, but with war in her eyes. She didn't promise forgiveness. She demanded change. And so, for the first time in his life, he fought for himself. Rehab wasn't a miracle. It was war. The detox nearly broke him. The flashbacks, the shame, the silence, it all came crashing down. But brick by brick, scream by scream, he began to rebuild the man he once buried. And in 1991, something impossible happened. He returned with no more tears, an album forged not from spectacle, but from survival. Tracks like "Mama, I'm Coming Home" weren't just hits. They were confessions. A man clawing his way back to the surface. A man saying, "I'm still here." And I finally understand what I almost lost. Sharon stood beside him, not as his savior this time, but as a soldier, fighting with him. Not for him. I owe her my life, Ozzy admitted years later. Not once, but every single day. But this wasn't a fairy tale, because survival didn't mean peace. And what came next would prove that even when the storm calms, the war inside never really ends. He had survived poverty, addiction, exile, and loss. He had been fired, forgotten, mourned, and resurrected. But what Ozzy Osbourne couldn't escape was time. The 2000s were supposed to be his golden years. Black Sabbath's legacy was secure. New generations were discovering his music. And with the launch of the Osbournes in 2002, the world got a different view of the so-called Prince of Darkness confused, hilarious, shuffling around the house, muttering under his breath like a heavy metal sitcom dad. It made him lovable, relatable, human. But even as the cameras rolled, his body was starting to fall apart. Then came December 8th, 2003. What was meant to be a casual quad bike ride on his estate turned into a full-blown medical crisis. The vehicle flipped. Ozzy was crushed underneath. Broken collarbone, shattered ribs, a fractured neck vertebra, collapsed lungs. He stopped breathing. For 8 days, he was in a coma. Sharon later admitted, "I thought I was going to lose him. I was bracing for the goodbye." But in true Ozzy fashion, he woke up. And within months, he walked onto a stage again, bruised, shaky, but alive, still. Something had changed. The fire was still in his soul, but his body was starting to betray him. Chronic pain became a shadow that followed him everywhere. And in 2019, just when he thought he had stabilized, another fall re-injured the very spine that had been reconstructed after the quad accident. It was like the past had come back, not as memory, but as punishment. And then came the final blow. Parkinson's disease. His balance, his coordination, even his voice, everything he once used to define himself was slipping, slowly, quietly, cruelly. He kept the diagnosis private at first, not out of pride, but protection. "I didn't want to break anyone's heart," he said later. "I didn't want people to think I was giving up." When he finally shared the truth in 2020, the world didn't turn away. It leaned in, because despite the tremors, despite the surgeries, despite the walker and the canes, he kept going. He released Ordinary Man, an album soaked in pain, memory, and astonishing clarity. It wasn't just music. It was a man speaking directly to the end. "I'm not ready to hang up my mic yet," he declared. "I've still got something to say." And he meant it, even as therapy became part of his daily life. Even as railings lined the halls of his Buckinghamshire home. Even as his hands shook and his legs buckled. He created. Because the thing Parkinson's couldn't steal was his purpose. Behind the scenes, Sharon remained his rock. His kids, now grown, stood beside him. And though the spotlight had dimmed, the fight hadn't. "I wake up in pain," he said, "but I'm still breathing. That's enough." It wasn't loud anymore. It wasn't chaos. It was a low, steady growl, the kind only legends know how to make. But even legends have to say goodbye. By 2025, the Prince of Darkness was no longer prowling the stage. He was walking slowly, carefully, sometimes not at all. The tremors had worsened. The pain had sharpened. And Parkinson's disease had taken more than just control of his body. It had begun to rewrite how the world saw him. But Ozzy Osbourne had one last chapter to write, and he was going to write it his way. On July 5th, 2025, Ozzy returned to the place where it had all begun, Birmingham. They called it Back to the Beginning, but it felt more like the end of an era. Over 40,000 fans packed the stadium. Millions more watched online. The air was thick with reverence. When Ozzy appeared, leaning on a cane, Sharon at his side, the crowd didn't scream. They went silent, because everyone knew this wasn't just a concert. This was a goodbye. His voice trembled. His hands shook. But when the first note rang out, It was as if time folded in on itself. Each lyric carried the weight of decades. Every riff echoed with memory. And when he looked into the crowd, eyes wet with age and fire, he whispered, "This may be the last time I ever stand on a stage." And just like that, the curtain began to fall, not with a bang, but like dusk settling over a battlefield. Soft, final, sacred. That night, every dollar from the concert, $190 million, was donated to causes that mirrored the pain he had lived through. Parkinson's research, Birmingham Children's Hospital, Acorn Children's Hospice. This wasn't just generosity. This was his final vow. "I'm not here to sell music anymore," he said. "I'm here to give something back." In the weeks that followed, he rarely left his home. He sat in the garden, headphones on, sometimes humming along to riffs only he could hear. He recorded a few final podcast episodes with Sharon, just the two of them, unfiltered, unscripted, peeling back the curtain one last time. And on July 22nd, 2025, the man who had once screamed loud enough to rattle the world finally fell silent. There were no fireworks, no press conferences, just family, just love, just peace. But what he left behind? That was louder than any encore. His will, finalized in 2024, wasn't about empire. It was about meaning. Trusts were established for his children and grandchildren. But a massive portion of his fortune, over $220 million, was directed toward mental health programs for musicians, addiction recovery centers, working-class youth scholarships, and animal rescue organizations. "I owe the dogs," he once wrote in a handwritten note now attached to the will. "They gave me back to myself when I was ready to disappear. So I owe them the rest of me." That note will be read aloud publicly per Sharon's request, because even in death, he wanted the message to echo, and it does. His children Amy, Kelly, Jack, Jessica, and Louis now carry that flame. Kelly with her strength, Jack with his quiet loyalty, Amy with her music, Jessica and Louis always nearby. Even if away from the spotlight, they aren't just heirs. They are the keepers of his roar. And in his final act, Ozzy made sure the world knew. Music didn't just save him. It might save someone else too. Azie. Osbourne didn't just sing. He survived louder than pain, louder than addiction, louder than death itself. And when his voice finally quieted, the silence he left behind was deafening in its own way. He wasn't perfect. He was honest. He wasn't polished. He was raw. And that's what made him unforgettable. Through every scream, every stumble, every comeback, he taught us something rare in a world addicted to perfection. That broken things can still shine. That noise can be healing. That survival is its own kind of music. So if his story moved you, if his voice ever reached into your darkest moment and reminded you to keep going, drop a comment. Share a lyric, a memory, a moment. Because Ozzy's legacy isn't written in platinum records or stage lights. It lives in you. He didn't fade away. He became the silence we still hear, the echo that reminds us we're still here too. So rest now, Ozzy. You screamed for us when we had no voice, and now we'll carry the sound for you.